The Britannica Encyclopedia defines a failed state as, quote, a state that is unable to perform the two fundamental functions of the sovereign nation-state in the modern world system. It cannot project authority over its territory and peoples, and it cannot protect its national boundaries. The governing capacity of a failed state is attenuated such that it is unable to fulfill the administrative and organizational tasks required to control people and resources, and can provide only minimal public services. Its citizens no longer believe that their government is legitimate, and the state becomes illegitimate in the eyes of the international community. A failed state is composed of feeble and flawed institutions. Often, the executive barely functions while the legislature, judiciary, bureaucracy, and armed forces have lost their capacity and professional independence. A failed state suffers from crumbling infrastructure, faltering educational and health facilities, and deteriorating basic human development indicators, such as infant mortality and literacy rates. Failed states create an environment of flourishing corruption and negative growth rates, where honest economic activity cannot flourish. End quote. While some of these criteria, for example, recognition in the international community and the modern world system, are not applicable, all of the other points can be directly attributed to the New Republic, the government that rose in the place of the Galactic Empire in Star Wars after the Battle of Endor. Let's go through these one by one. As per the Britannica definition, the failed state is one that cannot secure the borders of its own territory and cannot project authority over its own people. This absolutely applies to the New Republic if we look at the state that it was in through its entire existence. It basically had no power over its borders, allowing pockets of the scattered imperial remnant to ferment into the First Order. It also did not have the administrative capability to adhere to the needs of its people, as we see in The Mandalorian, where many are living in poverty. This brings me to part 2 of the definition, that citizens of a failed state, quote, no longer believe that their government is legitimate. This is true also in The Mandalorian, when we see how Din Djarin considers the New Republic as basically a joke.
Let's go back to the core and report them to the New Republic.
That's a joke.
Thirdly, according to the Britannica definition, a failed state, quote, is composed of feeble and flawed institutions. Often the executive barely functions while the legislature, judiciary, bureaucracy, and armed forces have lost their capacity and professional independence, end quote. This is true because the New Republic Senate again became completely gridlocked, just like the Senate of the Old Republic, and its committees were virtually useless in solving the gigantic issue that was the rise of the First Order. As all of the barely functioning institutions within the New Republic squabbled, its death was already spelled out. The dissolution of the New Republic military is another checkmark on the count of this definition. Just take a look at what the remainings of the New Republic military looked like just a year before the firing of Starkiller Base. It cannot even be considered a galactic-scale fighting force, more like a collection of local planetary militias that together amounted to perhaps a systems army. But even then, with their disorganized nature, mounting any offensive or defensive operation for that matter would be next to impossible. I'd also clarify that even if the judicial, bureaucratic, legislative, and defense branches of the New Republic did still retain their professional independence, they had lost their capacity to work cohesively, as when Leia Organa was trying to convince them of the very real threat that was the First Order, their collective ignorance and self-interest ultimately hit them in the head later on in that regard. And finally, I'll address the last 2 points together because they are in some ways similar to one another. A failed state, according to Britannica, suffers from, quote, crumbling infrastructure, faltering utility supplies, educational and health facilities, and deteriorating basic human development indicators such as infant mortality and literacy rates. Failed states create an environment of flourishing corruption and negative growth rates where honest economic activity cannot flourish. End quote. The New Republic struggled to provide any sort of widespread education options to the outer reaches of the galaxy, unlike the Empire's academy programs. It gave no support to poverty-ridden systems which were living on the now deteriorating, unrenewed Imperial infrastructure. It did not create safe and reliable options for interplanetary commerce that were free from piracy or smuggling, unlike the Empire's corporate sector, which was specifically designed as a secure free trade zone. With regard to the economy, someone can indeed make the point that the New Republic's rise did balance the galactic economy, but the question really is, where did that money go to? Where were the infrastructure projects? Where was the military development apparatus? Where were the subsidies that they had promised all along? Well, they could only be in one place, and that is in the hands of the once again greedy senators and delegates, which rose to power to create yet another oligarchically structured state which worked to benefit only those in the highest echelons of power. One can now understand why so many groups like the miners on Morak, Moff Gideon's forces, and the Ikruk insurgents held onto the idea of the empire so long after its demise. The idea that the New Republic went and imitated the very worst elements that brought down its predecessor became unacceptable to them. So that's been my most recent take on the New Republic and why I think it was a failed state. Be sure to comment how you think the New Republic did in the comments below. As always, thanks for watching. This was the Alton Man, and I will be back.